Imagine this. The best pasta sauce you have ever tasted sits abandoned on a plate. Wasted sauce. That is a tragedy. If only you had used Barilla al Bronzo pasta. Its bronze-cut texture holds your sauce and scoops up every last drop. The Italians call that scarpetta. Capture sauce the Italian way. Barilla al Bronzo. Click or tap the banner to find out more.
Ah, Smart Water. Pure, crisp taste.
That's really good water.
It's the kind of water that says, I have my life together.
I do feel more sophisticated.
Smart Water. For those with a taste for taste. Grab yours today.
Hey, Immigrantly family. This is Saadia Khan. I have some great news for all of you. We recently launched our newsletter, which comes out 3 times a week. It's called Hyphenly, which is our no-fluff newsletter with hot takes, heartfelt stories, and all the feels of living in between cultures. Come for the nuance, stay for the vibes. You can find the link to subscribe in our show notes. Don't forget to subscribe. Welcome back to the Immigrantly Circle. As always, I am your host, Saadia Khan. Here at Immigrantly, we believe every story is part of a larger journey, one that challenges narratives, celebrates nuance, and reminds us how interconnected our journeys really are. Now, I have something interesting to share with you, a secret of sorts. As a kid, I used to create imaginary characters, talk to them, and live in their worlds. I'm sure a lot of you've done that. I am not a writer, but I've always admired how writers, especially fiction writers, can build entire realities, craft experiences, and in a way live multiple lives through the stroke of a pen. Which brings me to today's guest. Nishant Batsha is a writer and historian whose work explores migration, identity, and the afterlives of empire. His academic research has focused on Indian indentureship in places like Trinidad and Fiji, while his fiction carries these themes into powerful new directions. His debut novel, Mother, Ocean, Father, Nation, imagines a fictional island shaped by colonial legacies and political upheaval. His upcoming novel, A Bomb Placed Close to the Heart, set in early 20th century America, follows an Indian revolutionary and an Indian graduate student as they navigate love, surveillance, and politics in the shadow of war. What draws me to Nishant's work is how he moves between personal history, archival research, and narrative imagination, all while grappling with what it means to write stories that are both personal and distant, intimate and historical. I can't wait for you to partake in this conversation. So let's get started. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
How are you doing?
I am doing well. Up here near the border with Canada, I live in Buffalo. We went from winter to summer very quickly.
This year's been crazy, right? Weather-wise, I live in Westchester County, close to New York City. People think I live upstate New York. No, that's not true. I think so. You live upstate New York.
Well, I think the actual term would be Western New York, because upstate divides into all these sub regions, I suppose. So I moved here 5 years ago. So I'm new to all this lingo, but Western New York is what I suppose I'm representing.
How do you like it there?
It's the perfect place for a writer to live because it's pretty affordable out here. We moved out because my wife teaches at one of the local colleges, but when we moved here, I realized that I could be a writer close to full time. So I became a freelancer soon after we moved here. We were still able to buy a house. It's one of the last remaining places where I think you don't have to hustle in 100 different things as a writer. So it's cold, it's gray, that goes without saying. But I think there's something to be said for moving to more affordable places to pursue a life as a writer.
How different is it from San Francisco? Because you grew up there, right?
I mean, it's a little bit of a culture shock. Western New York and Buffalo, where I live, is it's a Rust Belt city. It used to have this very strong industrial core, and it deindustrialized in the 70s and 80s, and is still sort of suffering the hangovers from that. So it's not a growing population, though I think it grew for the first time in like 50 years in the 2020 census. So people are coming here. People are realizing it's a more affordable place to live, but it doesn't have the sort of constant influx of new people that New York City has, or the Bay Area has, or London has. And so it is, I think, as a result, a sort of slower pace of life, which works for me at the moment. I have two very small children. I'm trying to write. So at the phase of life that I'm in right now, it actually works pretty well. But I could see, if I were 10 years younger, it might be a little bit of a different story.
Talking about your writing, you have a PhD in history, but you also write fiction. Now, fiction is one genre that really fascinates me. I am not a writer, but I love that writers can really create their own realities and experience multiple lives in a way through fiction. How do you balance memory, fact, and imagination in your writing?
I think that's a great question. And one I think that gets at the heart of what I try to accomplish when writing fiction that is rooted in history. And when she was giving her BBC Reef lectures, Hilary Mantel said something like that she was a novelist and discovered she wanted to be a historian. And
Mm.
I found that I started my career as a historian and soon realized that I wanted to be a novelist. And it's not necessarily just a cute turn of phrase. I think it's a real outlook and infrastructure, really, of how I view my fiction. I mean, on Hilary Mantel's side, Wolf Hall reads almost like a piece of history. And she knows this. She knows that the most minute detail has a fidelity to the archive. In my fiction, I think because I'm coming out of a tradition that I identify most readily as being associated with the scholar and critic Saadia Hartman, who talked about critical fabulation, and that when you find historical subjects who aren't recorded in an archive, who aren't necessarily part of history, you are essentially fabulating. You're making things up, but you're doing so with the sense of a historian, the tools of a historian. You're doing so with a critical, educated eye. And I think I will sometimes play fast and loose with facticity, with dates, with names, with personages, with all sorts of things. But I think there really is a core historicity in my work because I'm just trying to get really close to the personal lives, the interior lives of these people who aren't necessarily being recorded for posterity. And so there is a bit of fabulation that is occurring within the apparatus of history.
Do these two ways of writing ever clash with each other?
I think it's less about clashing and more about just sort of the feeling and the style that you bring into the work from before the idea is even made or before the first word is written. It's how you're approaching the material. I think in both cases, there's a whole lot of research and archival research and primary source research. But I do think because I'm not trying to specifically recount a history, I feel a sort of freedom with the historical material. You're not going to read a book like this and see the wallpaper that existed at the time, whereas all the wallpaper in Wolf Hall is very historically accurate. So I don't think it's necessarily opposed. I do think it's more of like an outlook or a worldview.
Does it ever limit you in terms of how far you can go in your creative imagination, though, as a historian, because you're probably fact checking as you go?
I'm bound by realism, I suppose.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it's ultimately neither because, especially in A Bomb Place Close to the Heart, one of the things I'm most interested in beyond the history is a marriage, is a romance, is the evolution of two people's feelings towards themselves, their own ambition, and each other, and a sort of rushed marriage. And because none of that is recorded in any archive, there's a sort of space of full possibility there. And I think because that is the core, almost the spiritual center of the book for me, there is no limit to imagining how two people will at one point be on the world stage, but aren't quite there yet. They're just trying to figure themselves out. And I think the beauty of writing fiction is I get to explore the internality and the emotions and all the valences around that conflict.
As a writer, you've talked about how different it feels to write for yourself versus writing for others. Can you unpack that for me a bit? What changes for you emotionally or intellectually depending on who you think your audience is?
I think I'm going to turn that around a little bit. And it's only as I've written a little bit more and sort of gotten a little bit further on my own journey as a writer that I've gained the confidence to realize that writing is pretty solipsistic. I'm writing for my own pleasure at the end of the day, and I am the audience that I want to impress.
So you don't really think about your prospective audience at all?
I try not to. I try really just because the joy of the writing is in that solitude. And it also took a long time to come to terms with the fact that accolades and attention feels good in the moment, but it's sort of like a sugar rush. It feels hollow over the long term. And I think it's taken a long time to just really embrace the solitude is the best part. And if the solitude's the best part, then writing for myself is the best part. And so I suppose I imagine myself in the third person, how I would react to this if I were reading it. And so I have to play the role of audience and writer in that sense. But I think it just gets a little dangerous trying to imagine a sort of imaginary audience out there, what they want, what their interests are. People's interests and desires are fickle. And I think if you present them good writing that presents a compelling story, that's all they actually want. And so that's the same thing I want. So I just have to imagine myself as the reader and how I would react to the material. So I think it's taken a long time to develop that sense of solipsism, I suppose. But I embrace it wholeheartedly now.
Do you seek validation for your work from yourself?
I feel like, you hear writers talk about this, that, the joy is the writing. And as a younger writer, as a writer who is just starting out, I think I would always roll my eyes. I would say, oh, that's easy for you to say. But I do think the further you go on, and, there's a lot of external factors that are making writing and publishing worse, right? People read fewer books. The internet and social media is sort of cannibalizing people's attention and time. And the reading public is not growing. So sort of seeking validation in an ever shrinking space seems like a dangerous act for many reasons, self-esteem being one of them. So I think it's almost safer to not seek validation and then to seek one's joy and one's pleasure and one's self-satisfaction in the process itself. There's that old phrase, right? The process is the pleasure, the process is the reward. I think, it's trite and hackneyed, but I think it's trite and hackneyed because it's true. It's said all the time because there is a kernel of truth in it.
You said reading space is shrinking. That's true. But then we have other avenues, right? The auditory experience. Audiobooks are on the rise. A lot of people listen to books rather than read them. As a writer, how do you weigh two different tools and which one do you prefer and why?
I've actually never listened to an audiobook. So I know it is a way people engage with text. I have friends who the primary way they read is through audiobooks. And so I'm well aware that it's extremely common way of reading. It's just not my particular way of engaging with text. But I think a book or writing in general is always about sound. It's always about how it sounds. So a book well written, I think, translates into a good audiobook because a writer who is attuned to the sounds and flow of their sentences and paragraphs and the text as a whole is ultimately writing and not only a novel, but an audiobook script, I suppose. And so good writing, I think, is always able to be read out loud in addition to being read silently as text.
I like that.
Parents of tweens, if you're familiar with far-off drop-offs...
Dad, stop, right here.
Or get DMs about what's for dinner, you may be experiencing tween milestones. For your son or daughter, these can start at age 9. HPV vaccination, a type of cancer prevention against certain HPV-related cancers, can start then too.
For most, HPV clears on its own. But for those who don't clear the virus, it can cause certain cancers later in life.
Embrace this phase. Help protect them in the next.
Ask their doctor today about HPV vaccination. Brought to you by Merck.
As we said, you are a historian and a fiction writer. And you've said that a lot of your path, including your pivot to history, happened almost by accident. I will stop here and let you tell us that story. And then I have a follow-up question for you. How did it come about?
It's so interesting how things are the product of chance, and sometimes good chance and sometimes bad chance. I think the way I ended up on a historian's path is when I went to college. I did my undergraduate at Columbia. I had no idea what I was going to study. I remember that first semester, I was just more interested in making friends and having fun and not really interested in figuring out where my intellectual and personal goals were. And then I got terribly, terribly sick when I started my second semester of that freshman year. So sick, I had to withdraw from school for the semester. And we think of what happened to me now as sort of, we talk about long COVID or long Lyme. You get an initial illness and your body can't get over it for some reason or another. And I think I experienced something akin to that. And in the recovery time, I was treated by many great doctors. And I came back to campus and I said, I'm going to become a doctor. I was so enamored with how well I was treated in several hospitals. And I was like, I want to pay it back and go on this path. And of course, that did not work out.
You did not become a doctor?
I hit a wall in biology. That was the leader course for pre-meds at Columbia. I think the professor who taught that wrote the MCAT question. So she was very good at finding your weakness and exploiting it, I suppose. But simultaneously, while I was trying that out, I was trying a lot of things out. And so I decided to sample a bunch of classes as well. So I think part of me realized that pre-med was one choice among many. And I thought, okay, I'm going to try Latin American history, taught by this wonderful professor, Caterina Pizzigoni. And it had 80 or 90 people in it. And I remember just really enjoying the material and the class. And I wrote the first essay. And one of the TAs took me aside and said, you should meet with the professor. You have a talent for this. And of course, being 18, 19 years old, I was just totally enamored with being told I had a talent for anything. And I met with her in her office hours and she said, you should consider studying history. It's clear that there's some sort of interest and capacity you have. And so I began studying that and really found that I loved it. And I devoted myself to it for many years and went to Oxford for my master's degree after Columbia. And it was there that I was just given the time to just write anything. And I started writing essays and a little bit of short fiction and realized that I found that extremely captivating. And I sort of looked back on my time as a historian and it was the writing that drew me in and the process of finding an idea and thinking it through and seeing it to its completion. And so when I went back, I had already applied and got accepted to a PhD program at that point. So when I started graduate school in history, I was thinking, I'm done. I'm going to drop out of this program. I'm going to go maybe get an MFA, maybe just sort of loaf around for a while, but I'm going to try to figure out what my relationship to fiction and writing is. And because I was young and earnest, I emailed a bunch of people who were either in PhD programs, finished PhD programs, or had dropped out of them and were also authors. And, most people ignored my message, but a few replied, and I had coffee with them. And that was the benefit of living in New York City. So I was able to just meet with these people and sort of ask them for life advice. And everyone said that I should really strongly consider staying. I was being given health insurance as a graduate student. I had a stipend. I was at a university. I was reading interesting things, thinking interesting things. And I said, that's a great place to be as a novelist. So figure out a way to balance both. And I took their advice and I did both simultaneously. And I was writing a dissertation while working on my first novel. And ultimately, when I left graduate school, I stuck more with being a novelist rather than pursuing the path of a professional historian. But as a result, most of my books are now deeply inflected by historical thinking, by the archive, by history, because those two things developed very much in tandem.
Your story is particularly interesting to me because you talk about chance, right? You could have been an anthropologist, you could have been a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Had you attended another class that you really liked, or if it resonated with you. And that's so important to understand, especially as an 18 or 19-year-old. Sometimes we don't have a passion for something, right? We are just on a journey to self-discovery. But I'm curious to know, has chance ever worked against you? Have there been moments where a random turn didn't serve you so well?
Oh, that's a great question. And nothing is coming to mind. And I think nothing is coming to mind because writing is filled with so many mischances and rejections that you sort of they just filter right past you like you're a great big baleen whale, and the water's just falling out through the baleen, and that's all the rejection and misfortune that occurs to you as a writer. So I'm sure there's just lots of missed opportunities and chances that have slipped right past me, but because rejection and misfortune become part and parcel of a writer's life, I don't dwell on them as much as I used to. And so nothing is coming to mind right now. But that's not to say that it doesn't happen. It happens so frequently that I can't latch onto one.
This episode is brought to you by Temptations Cat Treats. Your cat will come running for the perfectly irresistible Temptations Creamy Puree and Temptations Lickable Spoon Cat Treats. The best time to feed lickable cat treats to your cat is anytime. Feed by hand for a playful moment, in a bowl for a creamy treat, or as a topper to make mealtime fun. Visit temptationstreats.com to learn more.
Meta AI is the personal AI to help you with whatever you need. Plus, it meets you where you are. Not only is Meta AI now an app, but it's also on the apps you already know and love: Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger. Plus the Ray-Ban Meta glasses. It's easy to access wherever you are. So whether you're talking or texting, Meta AI is convenient to use throughout your day. Experience our newest AI that's tailored to you by downloading the Meta AI app. Try the Meta AI app today on the Apple App Store and Google Play.
Let's talk about the historian in you. So you have researched Indian indentureship in places like Fiji and Trinidad. Why did you decide to focus on that?
So this goes back to that moment when I wanted to drop out. When I came into graduate school, my historical focus was pretty dry. It was educational policy, mid-19th century educational policy in North India, particularly amongst a Muslim population during the time of British colonialism. Something I chanced upon as an undergraduate, found it interesting enough, and wrote a master's thesis on that, and then was going to do my PhD on that as well. And I just thought, my God, I can't do this for another 6 years. Some of which was I wanted to see what the students were thinking, what was actually going on in the classroom, but everything was at a sort of high level of policy or talking about what education should look like, but I was never able to get inside the classroom or close to any of the historical subjects. So I knew when I was going to come back to, or never left, but when I was going to recommit myself to being a historian, I had to have some sort of interest in what I was going to work on, some deep interest. And I was drawn towards indentureship kind of out of curiosity. When I was a child, I knew that there were Indians in Fiji because my parents sometimes would attend a temple in the Bay Area that was where the Pandit was Indo-Fijian. And so I had this like knowledge that there were Indians in other countries. And that sort of childhood memory came back to me in my own reading. And I started reading around this, reading quite widely. And I thought, oh, this is quite fascinating. I would love to research more deeply the history of Indian indenture. And the reason I chose Fiji and Trinidad is I wanted to do a comparative project between two disparate places that had two somewhat different experiences of the same historical process, but ultimately shared all these commonalities. And I wanted to find out what happens when you put these two places into conversation. And at the time, that was not a very common thing to do in the field. And I think since it's become a lot more common and accepted. So it was an interesting question to me. And then it became an interesting way to spend my mid-20s. I was living in Fiji for a while and in Trinidad. My research took me to the UK for several months. And I got to go to the University of Hawaii for a week. So I got to do all this travel that I never would have been able to do in it because of that choice. So it worked out.
Any surprises along the way in terms of what you discovered?
Well, some of those surprises became the fodder for my first novel. So one thing that I became deeply interested in when I was in Fiji gained independence in the 70s, has had 3 military coups since then. They've all been along racial lines. And I was interested in this idea of instability, political instability that fell upon a racial division in these indenture colonies, because I saw the same thing happen in Uganda. I saw the similar strife, but not happen in Guyana, to a lesser extent in Trinidad. It just kept repeating itself. And I just was surprised by this and deeply intrigued. And that question forms, I guess, a palimpsest to my first book, is that there is this racial strife that turns into political strife, that turns into a great reordering of a society. And so that first book that I wrote, Mother Ocean, Father Nation, took that surprise and that interest that was somewhat related to what I was researching, but also quite different, and turned it into a novel. That novel was not answering that question. It just formed the basis of one of the many conflicts inside that book. But that book could not have been written without the research I did, without the experience of being in these places, talking to people. When I was in Fiji, I spent some time with the Methodist Church of Fiji to write an essay about the Indian division of that, because the Methodists supported these coups, and yet there was an Indian division where Indians were worshiping in a church that had espoused their the removal from the country. So I was interested in that sort of schizophrenia, and that experience created the basis of that novel. So that novel would not have existed without that research.
Nishant, you are a child of immigrants, but your parents' experience is very different from your research focus. How did it give you permission or limit you in doing the work? Were you more conscious about how you were approaching research because it was somebody else's story that you were trying to document?
You have to read widely and deeply. You can't just approach it with a set of assumptions, right? And so I think that's a research and a historian sort of drive in there. And so when I was writing that book, I was reading a lot of poetry collections from Fiji and Trinidad, memoirs, fiction, history, sort of assimilating a lot of experience and knowledge to make sure that what I was writing spoke to a particular kind of history. Now, because I invented the country where the book was set, because I was taking elements of Uganda, taking elements of Fiji, taking elements of the British Caribbean, I didn't feel necessarily that I was stepping on anyone's toes, because I was stepping on everyone's toes. I was creating a place, a hybrid place based in history, but also completely new. But there were elements that I saw from a lot of experience that I wanted to work into it. The best example I could think of in that book, half of the book for one of the characters is set in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area. And when I was reading a lot of memoir material in particular, I would always see this refrain that folks who came from formerly indentured colonies, would often be seen as not Indian by people from India. There was this relationship between one of the characters and a boy who was, the child of engineers in the Bay Area. And there's a disconnect between them two. They see that each other as Indian, but there's a very quick recognition that they've experienced Indianness in wildly different ways. And they're sort of negotiating that. And the character also negotiates that in a sort of under the table labor agreement where she works as a nanny and doesn't want to, and the way she's treated by the Indian head of the household there. And so that came about by having a sort of empathy with the material that I saw and seeing these recurring themes and then wanting to work them into the text.
How do you define Indianness?
I think Indianness is defined by its capaciousness because it is such a broad category of cultures and religions and ethnicities and languages and historical experience. And so I think the only thing that could define it is its capacity to have a multitude of stories. And so I don't think there's any one specific thing that makes Indianness, especially in a diaspora situation. And then we could even expand that to include all of South Asia and have more cultures, more ethnicities, more languages. And so that capaciousness, I think, is what defines the region and the experience and the sort of multiplicity of stories that you encounter in a diaspora situation. I think one of the joys of being South Asian abroad is that you get to encounter a lot of different people and hear about their lives and the way they approach the world. And I would define Indianness just by its capacity to include a wildly different amount of experience.
Talking about experiences, what brought your parents to the US?
It's a great story. My father was pretty well set up in his career. He was working in Bihar in a city called the Bokaro Steel City. And he was a foreman or some sort of working in electrical engineering in the steel plant. And he just wanted to leave India and he just wanted to experience the rest of the world. And he already had two very young children, my two oldest sisters. They were, I want to say, 3 and 1, or maybe even younger. But he knew he didn't want to go to the UK because he didn't want to go back to be part of the British system. Australia, when he had applied for the visas, was still a white Australia, so there was no way of going to Australia. Canada required an exam to prove your engineering background. He didn't want to take a test. So that just left the United States. And so he left on his own to come to New York City, and he was getting a master's at the City College. And my mom stayed back in India with my two sisters. And she, after I think 6 months, was worried that he had abandoned her and he was never going to come back. So she called him, in a time of great expense for long distance calls, and said that one of my sisters was terribly ill and that he had to come back immediately. And he did at great expense. And she was fine. There was no illness. But that was a sort of warning that he had to bring her. And so they all came over and they first lived in Brooklyn and Borough Park, which I think is fascinating because it's like you come to the new world and it looks a lot like the old world in many different ways. People aren't speaking English. And there's a great story that my sisters, they didn't know English at the time, but they were playing with kids whose first language was Yiddish. And so they just had a play language to play with each other. And so that was their first experience of America. It was this sort of, it's like a UN play date in Brooklyn. But that's what brought them over, just a sort of desire to leave. No, he didn't come to pursue a degree. He came and then applied for the degree. He just wanted to leave India and see something new.
But you've been to India quite a few times, right? How do you see yourself as a child of immigrants when you go back? How do you fit into that Indianness?
I think sort of awkwardly, I suppose, like most people who go back. I'm fluent in Hindi, but not super fluent. I think, the best compliment I got, I was in Delhi at the time and it was just like an auto rickshaw driver. And I think we just got to talking and I said that I wasn't from India. And he didn't believe me. He thought I was just from like Bangalore or Hyderabad or something. And I was just visiting Delhi. He's like, it's clear you're not from Delhi or North India, but you're probably from here. You're from India. So he sort of was clued into the sort of insider outsiderness that I brought to it.
That's a huge compliment, though.
It was. I mean, I guess I was carrying myself Indian enough, but still a sort of, awkward interlocutor in the whole experience.
After spending so much time with these histories of displacement and movement and diaspora in all these different places, how has your understanding of identity and belonging shifted?
In both my books, if there is an antagonist in them, it's typically the nation itself. I explore the cracks and fissures of the nation and the way pressures of living in a nation make their way into a domestic space. I'm always intrigued by how outside political pressures are made manifest in very intimate spaces. And I think because of that, characters are often always at arm's length with the country that they find themselves in. And so I think I've become a lot more suspect of the sort of heroic migration narrative that you leave and you come to the promised land and it's great and you're going to stay here forever. I think there's a lot more ambiguity that my characters encounter with their desire to stay in the first place that they end up. And maybe there are other places, and maybe there are places that will better fit what they're looking for from the world.
That's such a good point. And sometimes I feel like as immigrants, and I can speak to my experiences, we don't think about the consequences, or we are not as intentional and as aware of, we are making this heroic journey. It's about just traveling, right? Exploring new places, meeting new people in the beginning, at least. Like when my husband and I came to the US in early 2000s, we were very young. This was obviously for college. And the idea was we'll study and then go back. So that heroism, I think it stems from the journey itself and not necessarily the intent.
It is difficult to move and it is difficult to find yourself in a new place. But I do think it's also difficult to find yourself in a new place. And so I think there is a set of questions that can come out of that self-discovery that could lead to a bigger journey or a journey onwards into new places, or sort of distrust of the place that you've landed. So I think there's a lot of different ideas and feelings and thoughts that are intersecting, I think, that out of that journey.
In many immigrant families, and I can probably speak to my own experiences, there are stories that go unspoken. Have there been silences in your own family history that you've tried to work around or have made you curious as a historian?
I'm not sure.
That's an answer.
I'm not. Yeah, I don't think so off the top of my head. So it goes back to the idea of chance. I think so much of my curiosity is the material that I chance upon and that captures my attention, and then I sort of stick with it for a while. I was thinking more about what we were talking about earlier with the process of self-discovery and opening yourself up to new experiences and ideas. And I think I experience that in miniature with every new book, in that there's a moment where I'm finished with one project and embarking upon another, where I just find myself incredibly open to everything, just with the knowledge that anything that I experience can become fodder for the next project. And that sort of baseline curiosity is, I think, what drives me more than any sort of archaeology of my own past. I think there's a willingness to just see what sticks. And sometimes it surprises me what sticks, but then it sticks rather quickly and then I'm in it and I can't. And for the next 3 or 4 years. That's what I'm thinking about all the time. And then it's done, and then and I'll never think about it again. It's a very odd process, but it is one of constant curiosity and casting a wide net out to the world.
As a writer or a historian, do you ever feel scared or hesitant that you may discover or unravel something that may be unpleasant for you personally? Or has that already happened?
Oh, it's already happened. So in that first book that I wrote, one thing that surprised me when I was in Trinidad, this is an experience that came out of travel, was I remember I ran into someone I knew, a childhood friend. It was a weird chance encounter. And his boyfriend at the time was from Trinidad. He was also Indian. And we just sort of took to hanging out. And I think because we were all Indian, there was a sort of shared assumption of, I don't know, racial superiority. And the things that he said about Black Trinidadians, I think it was shocking to me, absolutely shocking. And then later, the Airbnb I was staying in was run by this man named Garth, and he was Afro Trinidadian. And he took me to meet his grandmother at one point. It was like we just had lunch together. It was really cute. And I was telling her about the research I was doing. And at that very moment, I was researching these land grants that were given to indentured folks. When they finished their indenture, they got 5 acres of unimproved land that they could farm. If they could improve it and, farm it, it was theirs to keep. And she just sort of looked at me and she said, my people never got any land. And it was in that moment that, you realize that countries that have a harmonious racial understanding of each other don't have military coups. They don't have political strife. And so when I was writing that book, the characters come from a pretty middle of the road, like petty bourgeois family. They're shopkeepers. They're not going to have these sort of, enlightened views about race. And so part of writing the book was writing that racism into each character, also giving opportunities for that to be challenged. But their baseline assumption about the other is going to be one that was not pleasant for me to think about or write or empathize with, but to be true to the historical circumstance required me to write it into the book. And that was deeply uncomfortable, but I think it had, for the sake of verisimilitude, had to be put into there. And so I did find that the material and the circumstance was uncomfortable, but had to be put in. So I had to work through my own discomfort because I just wanted to yell at these characters and say, don't think this way. But, I had to write it. And in this book, there's a thread of eugenics throughout the book because eugenics was pretty popular in the 1910s. But eugenics wasn't just about, hating the other. There was the actual first president of Stanford was a rampant eugenicist, but also was deeply involved in anti-imperial activities and would invite the Indians that were on his campus who were involved in anti-colonial and anti-imperial activities into conversation and enjoyed making friendships with them because to believe in the purity of the races meant to believe that you have no business meddling in the affairs of others. And so there's this idea that people believed in this theory, and sort of putting it in there and having everyone believe in it is not something that I thought that I would have to do with this book, but it presents itself. And of course, because at the heart of the book is an interracial relationship between a white woman and an Indian man, they're constantly hitting the limits of their own idea of eugenics. But I just can't come in and say eugenics is stupid. I had to sort of find the way in which it existed at the time, work its way in organically, and discover its limits organically through the romance of these two characters.
Yeah, because human existence offers so many different contradictions. We are good, bad, evil, all at the same time. Does it ever bog you down?
I think that contradiction is the joy of writing fiction because you get to explore people's own grappling with their sense of self, and they're trying to put two opposing forces into conversation. And that dialectic is kind of what makes our personality and what makes our relationships and what makes our experience with the world. So I think that is actually one of the more interesting parts of writing fiction, is sort of exploring and getting deep in the muck with that material. I think in A Bomb Placed Close to the Heart, some of that involves the idea of abortion and contraception. There's a Cora, one of the main characters, She is a feminist. She does not want to have children. But what does it mean to, be presented with an unplanned pregnancy? And what does that mean at the time? And what does that mean for the character? And so that was a lot of research that I had to take on and a sort of burden that I took on for the book. But it was deeply fascinating for me. And also has a political valence in the time that we live in now. So I think that is a burden that I think all novelists would gladly shoulder.
We started the conversation with your upcoming novel and how at the center of it, there is a romance. Why romance? Why love?
So that goes back to the historical material that informs it. So the book is based on the real life story of M.N. Roy, who would go on to found the Communist Party of Mexico, the Communist Party of India, was deeply involved in the communist movement, and Evelyn Trent, who is his intellectual interlocutor, was also the co-founder of those organizations. They met at the Stanford campus. They married under very heady political circumstances, which are now known as the Hindu-German conspiracy trials. Basically, at the time, if you were against the British, you were for the Germans. And when the U.S. went to war, you were to be rounded up and tried for your ideas and your thoughts. And so what's interesting about them is that they married, they went to Mexico, they were meeting with Lenin and Trotsky in Mexico. They go to Berlin, they spend several years in Berlin, they have a very acrimonious divorce. And Evelyn Trent is written out of history in that moment because he will never mention her again. She's not mentioned in his memoirs. He doesn't mention her in any of his letters after that. And so he does his best to write her out of history. When she goes back to the United States, she lives a quiet life in Auburn, California, working in the welfare office, occasionally writing for the San Francisco Chronicle. But her house burns down in 1962, and most of her personal papers are lost in that fire. And so she is written out of history doubly now. M.N. Roy refuses to acknowledge her, and most of her papers are lost. Her published material exists, but a lot of the good historical stuff is gone. Knowing that future and knowing that they would become so important, I was just interested in the idea of what does it look like to meet and fall in love and have this sense of world historical ambition? And what does that relationship look like under very strained political circumstances? How does that evolve? You don't know you're going to be famous yet. You just have this raw ambition. The world's kind of going to hell. What does that do to your very fragile and new love? And so to me, that sort of human understanding of the self and the other, ambition and compromise, singleness and being in a union, to me was so deeply interesting that I wanted to make that the core of the book. And I think as a result, the book has this sort of sense of a parlor drama because there's all this stuff happening. They're moving from one part of the country to the other. They're evading arrest. But the core conflict is, who am I? Who is this person I love? Do I still even love them? Do I want to love them? What does it mean to love them? And what does it mean for my own ambition to constantly have to compromise for them? Because so much of love and marriage is compromise.
It is. It is. What has it taught you about love?
I did so much reading about love for this book. A lot of French theory, Roland Barthes, Lacan. I was also reading, memoirists like Annie Ernaux and Duras. One thing that I really centered on and focused it on was that desire often comes out of a place of lack. Whatever we find that we lack in ourselves, we see and love in the other. Now, I think that sense of lack can also fuel one's own ambitions. And so as you start to fill that lack with your own capacity, how do you feel about the person that you once most readily identified with fulfilling that lack? But I do think that sort of tension in love was something, you don't give a lot of thought to that in day-to-day life, but it was something that I wanted to explore deeply.
Oh my gosh, this is so interesting. Does love even exist?
I think it does. I think it's a deep feeling of respect and affection and attraction. Those all are things that are in there. But I do think there is a kernel of fulfillment that we need. And to be fulfilled means that something was empty at some point and it has to be filled. And I do think love comes to fill those empty parts. And I think both characters become aware of that.
So to me, it seems more like a selfish undertaking than selfless.
There's a lot of selfishness, but then there's moments where they have to realize the selflessness. What does it mean to put the other before you? What does that mean for yourself? And I do think by the end of the book, they've grappled with that a little bit. And they're willing to concede the selfishness a little bit to the selflessness. So I think young love, at the time of when this book is set, there wasn't protracted dating. It's like there is attraction and then there's marriage. And once you're in marriage, you've committed yourself to each other. And that commitment locks you in,
right?
For better or for worse. And so the moment they're locked in is when all these cracks start appearing in the foundation of the relationship, and they become willing to fix it. That too is a great exploration of the self and the other.
Nishant, in the end, if you were to define the United States of America in the context of how its history is written and being told, how would you do that?
There's so much to tell that it's hard to pin it down to one particular instance. The only thing that I wish would not happen is for stories that are of, let's say, minoritized populations to be seen as histories of minoritized populations. I think they are, and I took great pains to frame this not as an Asian American book or an Asian American history, but as an American history, an American archive, and an American story. Because you begin reading this and you start seeing folks from all walks of life. There's a lot of, Irish revolutionaries in this book. And then there's New York socialists in this book. And there's weird folks in Palo Alto in this book. And so you begin to write one story and you write a lot of other stories in the process. So I do think the history and the narrative of the United States is, by its very nature, very diverse. I just wish in the reception of that material wasn't siloed into particular histories or particular points of view, but instead seen as part and parcel of the greater story.
Yes, I love it. Where can people find the book? It's coming out in July, right?
It's out July 1st, available where all books are sold.
Do you have preference?
I would hope that you'd support your local bookstore. I think the industry thrives on local bookstores and readers going into their local bookstores. So head into your local independent bookshop and find it there.
Thank you so much, Nishant. This was such a wonderful conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Loved this conversation with Nishant. Learned so much about fiction writing. As I said in my intro, I used to create and imagine characters in my mind. I'm not a writer, but still I love to interact with fictional characters, and hence this conversation especially fascinating and important to me. If you liked it, share it with a friend, a family member. Give us a good review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Help us grow. Subscribe to our newsletter. Subscribe to our channel called Immigrantly Uninterrupted on Apple Podcasts. Guys, there are so many ways to support us. Help us grow. This episode is produced and written by me, Saadia Khan. The editorial review is done by Shay Yu. Our sound designer and editor is Lou Raskin. Our theme music is done by Simon Hutchinson. Other music by Epidemic Sound. Come back next week when we have another incredible story to share with all of you. Until then, take care and be kind to yourself and